HeartfeltStories, let's get into the story. Caroline Hendricks adjusted her glasses as she sat quietly on the third row of the packed seminar hall at the Eco Convention Center in Lagos. The program was titled Positioning Yourself for the Job Market, and it attracted hundreds of fresh graduates, job seekers, and young entrepreneurs. Caroline, a poised and soft-spoken 27-year-old with dark skin, natural braids tucked into a neat bun, and a simple Ankara blouse she had designed herself, clutched her notepad tightly. Her fashion sense wasn't just stylish, it spoke volumes about her identity, creative, grounded, and intentional. Born and raised in Surulere, Caroline had learned resilience early. After losing her mother to cervical cancer at 17 and with no support from her estranged father, she relied on tailoring skills she picked up from her mother to survive. She dreamed of owning a fashion brand that would compete with Nigeria's biggest names, but for now, she was content running errands for Madam Bucky's sewing shop while attending free trainings like this one. 2 seats away sat Vincent James, restless and visibly distracted. At 29, Vincent had graduated top of his class from the University of Benin's law faculty but was still jobless 3 years later. Raised in a small flat in Ajij by his widowed mother who sold provisions at the roadside, Vincent had always seen education as his ticket out of poverty. But reality had hit hard. Since being called to the bar, he had knocked on countless firm doors with no offer in sight. On this day, he'd only reluctantly dragged himself to the seminar, encouraged by his best friend Deli, hoping something, anything, would finally give. Dressed in his one and only blazer and borrowed tie, he looked the part but felt invisible in the crowd. When the panelists began, Vincent barely paid attention, until a guest speaker said something that changed everything. Success isn't just about who you know. It's about who remembers your value when opportunity knocks. During a brief intermission, a seat reshuffle brought Caroline and Vincent side by side. He had dropped his pen, and she picked it up, offering it with a warm smile. That single exchange sparked a light conversation, first about the seminar, then about their individual dreams. Caroline shared her passion for ethical fashion and how she wanted to empower women through style. Vincent, intrigued by her calm strength, found himself opening up about his frustrations and his dreams of becoming a voice for the voiceless in courtrooms. They spoke for over 20 minutes, not noticing the crowd returning for the next session. There was no flirtation, just an honest exchange between 2 strangers brought together by hardship and hunger for change. As they parted ways at the end of the seminar, Vincent hesitated, then asked shyly, "Can I call you sometime?" Caroline nodded without hesitation. Neither of them knew it yet, but that moment marked the beginning of a story neither success nor betrayal could erase. 3 weeks had passed since the seminar at Eco Convention Center, yet Vincent James found himself replaying that moment beside Caroline Hendricks more times than he could count. Her voice lingered in his mind, soft, deliberate, and filled with a kind of hope that made him feel less like a failure and more like a man still becoming. Their phone conversations became routine, short chats about the day, random jokes about Lagos traffic, and long moments of shared silence that spoke more than words. Caroline never judged his unemployment. Instead, she asked him questions that challenged him to reflect. She saw something in him even he had begun to forget. On a rainy Thursday evening, as they sat under the faded umbrella of a roadside buka after a workshop in Surulere, Vincent finally opened up fully. "I passed the bar," he said, stirring his rice slowly. "But I couldn't afford the final certification to join the legal registry. That's why no one will hire me." Caroline stared at him, absorbing every word, her heart already forming a decision. That night, she returned home to her single-room apartment above Madam Bucky's sewing shop. The electricity was out, and the hum of a nearby generator filled the humid air. Caroline sat on the edge of her bed, staring at a rusted biscuit tin that had served as her personal bank for years. Inside it was N187,000, her entire savings. It was meant for her dream, registering her fashion label, printing custom tags, buying fabric in bulk. But as she sat in the dark, her heart wrestled with a quiet conviction. Vincent hadn't asked for money. He wasn't like the men who mocked her hustle or pretended to care. He was driven, humble, and stuck, just like she had once been. Her decision wasn't born of romance, but of alignment. She saw her mother in him, hardworking and deserving, but overlooked. The next morning, before doubt could return, Caroline quietly transferred N180,000 to Vincent with a message, "For your certification. Go get what you deserve." Vincent stared at his phone in disbelief. He paced his room in a jeech for over 10 minutes, torn between gratitude and guilt. No woman had ever believed in him like this, not even family. With shaking hands, he called her. "Caroline, I don't even know what to say." She chuckled softly. "Then don't say anything. Just promise me one thing: when you make it, don't forget where you started." That promise would become a foundation, etched deeper than affection. Caroline's sacrifice wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, intentional, and exact, the kind that shifts destinies. And for the first time in years, Vincent slept with a smile on his face, unaware that her selfless act had just rewired the course of both their lives. The months that followed were a whirlwind of transformation. With Caroline's quiet sacrifice still fresh in his heart, Vincent completed his legal certification with distinction and began applying to firms with renewed confidence. The difference was noticeable. No longer desperate, he now walked into interviews with purpose and clarity. After multiple rejections and long days roaming under the sun in his old suit, Vincent finally received an offer letter from Goldbridge & Co., a mid-tier law firm based in Victoria Island. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a foot in the door, a beginning. When he called Caroline to break the news, her scream of joy pierced through his eardrum. "I knew it," she said proudly. "I knew you were built for more." That night, Vincent visited her with gala and malt, not champagne, but they celebrated like royalty. It wasn't about the food, it was about the promise of a future finally shifting into motion. While Vincent adjusted to the demanding hours and stiff-collar environment of corporate law, Caroline quietly nurtured her own vision. With her savings depleted, she returned to selling customized Ankara tote bags and face masks on Instagram, slowly building her customer base again. Encouraged by recurring sales and loyal clients, she secured a tiny corner shop in Yaba Market, repainting the cracked walls with pastel pink and hanging a handmade sign that read "Caroline Stitches." She would arrive every day before sunrise and leave long after the sun set, stitching, sketching, and smiling through fatigue. Madame Bucky, proud of her former apprentice, often stopped by with praise and leftover fabrics. The shop was small, barely enough to stretch 2 rolls of fabric, but it was hers. The independence fueled her spirit, and soon, her small business began to draw attention from university students and working-class women alike who adored her bold but classy designs. As both their careers began to bloom, so did something tender between them, something unspoken yet undeniable. It wasn't rushed or born of excitement, it had been built brick by brick, day by day. One evening, Vincent surprised Caroline at her shop with a framed certificate from his firm, Employee of the Month. Beneath it was a handwritten note: "Because of you." Caroline didn't respond with words. She simply hugged him tightly and whispered, "I'm proud of you." A few weeks later, under a mango tree beside the shop, with a modest gold ring and trembling hands, Vincent proposed. There were no violins or flashy photographers, just honesty, shared history, and genuine love. Caroline said yes. And with their families present, they married in a simple church ceremony, vowing to grow together no matter the weather. At that moment, neither of them could have imagined the storm life had quietly begun to prepare. In the 2 years following their modest wedding, Vincent and Caroline James became a couple admired by many and envied by more. Vincent's brilliance in litigation quickly caught the attention of the senior partners at Goldbridge & Co. His courtroom demeanor, calm, methodical, and sharp, earned him a reputation as a silent storm. While other junior lawyers chased quick wins, Vincent devoted himself to cases that required patience and integrity. He won a major land dispute for a high-profile real estate firm, and that victory solidified his name within legal circles. When the firm expanded their executive board, Vincent was the youngest and newest partner to be named, an accomplishment that sent waves of pride through his family, especially his mother Najij, who cried over the phone when he shared the news. "You don carry our name go better place," she whispered. Meanwhile, Caroline had turned her small Yaba shop into a fashion hub for modern Nigerian women. With consistent demand, she leased a larger space in Lekki Phase 1 and hired 2 young fashion students as apprentices. Her brand, Caroline Stitches, blended Afrocentric elegance with minimalist structure, offering designs that catered to women who wanted to feel both powerful and feminine. Her social media presence skyrocketed after a Nollywood actress wore her outfit to a movie premiere. Orders began pouring in from Port Harcourt, Calabar, and even Ghana. That was when she knew it was time to take a leap. With the help of a government fashion grant she had quietly applied for, Caroline opened a new showroom in Abuja. It was a calculated risk, and she handled it like a seasoned businesswoman, hiring a local manager, shipping inventory in bulk, and flying between Lagos and Abuja bi-weekly to oversee operations. Despite the growing demands of their respective careers, Vincent and Caroline remained each other's anchor. Their evenings were filled with dinner talks about case strategies and design sketches, laughter over burnt rice, and quiet moments of exhaustion when they simply lay side by side in silence. They bought their first house in Chevron Drive, painted the walls together, and turned the guest room into an office where they both worked late into the night. From the outside, they looked like a perfect match, ambition wrapped in humility. But with success came distance, not in love but in availability. Meetings became longer, travel became more frequent, and their schedules no longer synced as perfectly as before. Yet they both trusted the strength of what they had built. In Caroline's eyes, Vincent was still her husband, her friend, and her miracle. And in Vincent's eyes, Caroline was still the woman who believed in him when he had nothing. Neither of them noticed that life was about to test just how unshakable those foundations truly were. It was during the legal proceedings of a billion-naira estate dispute that Vincent James first encountered Juliet Charles. She had walked into the Goldbridge & Co. boardroom like she owned the building, not just because she was one of the firm's most lucrative clients, but because confidence oozed from every step she took. Juliet was the sole heir to the Charles legacy, a family known in Abuja and Lagos for their hospitality empire and high society influence. She was in her mid-30s, tall, strikingly beautiful with rich chocolate skin, and always adorned in tasteful designer wear from head to toe. Everything about her, her posture, perfume, and poise, spoke of old money and untouchable elegance. Vincent had read about her before, mostly in lifestyle columns, but none of the glossy pages did justice to the aura she exuded in person. Juliet was used to men being nervous around her, stumbling over words or overcompensating to impress her. But Vincent was different. His demeanor was respectful, yet professional, unaffected by her presence. That intrigued her. During their first consultation, she noticed how he barely glanced at her designer jewelry or luxury bag, focusing instead on the technicalities of the case. He explained legal loopholes and asset recovery strategies with an ease and clarity that impressed her. "You don't talk like most lawyers," she said mid-conversation, smiling with a tilt of amusement. Vincent simply replied, "I was raised to be precise, not dramatic." Juliet chuckled, her interest piqued. She requested that he be the lead counsel on her case. Though protocol usually dictated rotation among partners, Juliet's influence made her preference unquestionable. Vincent was assigned. The following weeks brought frequent meetings, some in the office, others in private lounges or Juliet's penthouse in Ikoyi. At first, Vincent kept things strictly formal, but it was impossible not to notice the world Juliet occupied. She had access to people, places, and privileges that seemed otherworldly. Her car collection, international contacts, and the way she seemed to glide through elite circles with a glass of champagne and zero apologies mesmerized him. It wasn't just the wealth, it was the comfort she had within it, the ease with which she handled boardrooms and ballroom galas alike. As a boy who grew up in a one-bedroom flat with leaking ceilings, Vincent had worked his way into wealth, but Juliet was born into it. She embodied the lifestyle he had only begun to touch. And though he didn't yet realize it, a subtle shift was beginning. For the first time in his marriage, Vincent found himself drawn to someone else, not by love, but by the tantalizing sparkle of a world he never thought he could belong to. It began with small things, missed dinners, rescheduled dates, forgotten calls. Caroline, ever understanding, assumed Vincent's new responsibilities were simply the demands of rising success. After all, she too was constantly on the move between Lagos and Abuja, juggling clients, suppliers, and expansion plans for Caroline's stitches. But over time, the pattern became undeniable. Vincent no longer asked how her meetings went, nor did he comment on her new collections or store updates. His evenings were filled with firm-related social events, client cocktail hours, and weekend retreats with strategic partners. Caroline would wake to find empty space beside her in bed, a lingering cologne trail, and apology texts that felt rehearsed. "Sorry, babe, had to attend a client dinner. Let's talk in the morning." But morning came and passed with only silence. Vincent had begun gravitating toward a new circle, one filled with influencers, politicians' children, and lifestyle entrepreneurs who spoke in acronyms, traveled spontaneously, and didn't understand the meaning of struggle. Through Juliet Charles, he had been introduced to elite clubhouses in Banana Island, private art viewings in Maitama, and wine-tasting dinners where a single bottle cost more than Caroline's monthly business rent. At first, he merely observed, grateful to be included. But slowly, he adapted. He started wearing imported suits tailored in Italy, swapped his Corolla for a matte black Range Rover, and began attending functions that had nothing to do with law. His conversations shifted from justice and hard work to leverage, legacy, and luxury. And with every toast he raised in another high-rise penthouse, he drifted further away from the woman who once paid for his certification. Caroline, grounded and intuitive, felt the change but remained calm. She never confronted him with accusations. Instead, she tried to reconnect the way she knew how, through acts of service. She cooked his favorite meals when he was home, left sticky notes of encouragement on his mirror, and even surprised him once at his office with a leather briefcase engraved with his initials. But Vincent barely reacted. He was always distracted, glancing at his phone, responding to Juliet's urgent messages, or preparing for another networking dinner. When Caroline gently asked if they could plan a weekend away to reconnect, he brushed it off with a half-hearted, "We'll find time, babe. Things are just crazy right now." What neither of them admitted was that time was no longer the issue, priority was. And in Vincent's evolving world, Caroline was no longer at the center. He didn't say it aloud, but his actions had begun whispering what his heart hadn't yet acknowledged, that somewhere between power and prestige, he was no longer the man she fell in love with. Juliet Charles was never loud in her influence. She didn't need to be. Her strength lay in her subtlety, in the way she posed questions that burrowed into the mind like whispers and bloomed into doubts. It was during one of their late-evening legal consultations at her Kauai penthouse, glass windows framing the city lights, that she first began weaving her web. Vincent was seated across from her, reviewing final submissions for a property injunction, when Juliet leaned back, swirling a glass of wine in her hand. "You know," she said softly, "you're not like most of them." Vincent looked up, confused. "Them?" She smiled. "Men who settle. Who find comfort in simplicity and never ask if they could have more. You don't belong in the shadows of a small life, Vincent. You were made for spaces that match your brilliance." The comment seemed innocent. Complimentary, even. But it lingered long after he left her apartment. Juliet, with her designer shoes and imported wine, was deliberately placing herself as a mirror, one that reflected who he could be if he stopped anchoring himself to the past. Over the weeks, she layered her words skillfully. "Why haven't you moved to Banana Island yet?" she'd ask. "Your office deserves a better address than Lecky, don't you think?" Or, "Caroline is sweet, but isn't she too grounded for where you're going?" She never criticized Caroline directly, just used soft comparisons and rhetorical questions that made Vincent rethink his reality. Slowly, doubt crept in. Was Caroline truly his equal anymore? Or had he outgrown the woman who once held him up when he had nothing? Juliet was strategic. She invited Vincent to curated networking events where young CEOs brought their wives dressed in couture and dripping in diamonds. She introduced him to government officials who offered under-the-table contracts, real estate tycoons with offshore accounts, and women who laughed just a little too long at his jokes. Through it all, she played her part perfectly, not as a seductress, but as a visionary. A partner who understood the world he was destined for. The contrast became sharper. Caroline with her modest boutique, ankle-length gowns, and devotion to simple joys, and Juliet, radiant in silk, bold in her ambition, and unapologetically elite. Vincent didn't see it then, but he was being groomed, slowly, deliberately. Not by lust, but by ego. And the more Juliet painted Caroline as a relic from a past he had survived, the more Vincent began to question whether staying with his wife was loyalty or limitation. Caroline stood by the kitchen counter one Friday evening, the scent of coconut jollof rice wafting through the air, her neatly set dining table waiting for two. She glanced at the wall clock, 8:47 p.m. Vincent hadn't called, hadn't texted. Again. She reached for her phone, hoping to see a missed call or a message explaining the delay, but the screen remained blank. Sighing, she removed her apron, carefully packed the food into sealed containers, and returned to her quiet bedroom. This wasn't the first time he was late, but something about it felt heavier now, like the space between them was no longer caused by schedules, but by silence. Vincent's absence was becoming more frequent, but it was the emotional distance that worried her most. He had always been driven, yes, but he was also attentive, until lately. The signs were subtle at first. He no longer asked her how her fittings went or complimented her new designs. When she returned from Abuja after securing a corporate contract for uniforms, he had barely looked up from his laptop, murmuring a distracted, "That's nice." The warmth in his eyes had cooled, replaced by a calm detachment she couldn't name. Even their Sunday mornings, their sacred tradition of breakfast and soft gospel music, had been replaced by him stepping out early for emergency briefs. Caroline began waking up to empty sheets and going to bed with unanswered questions. The house no longer echoed with shared laughter or playful banter. It was still beautiful, still well-kept, but sterile, as though only one of them was still trying. At first, she blamed herself. Maybe I've been too busy with work. Maybe he feels neglected. She tried adjusting, canceling business trips, closing the boutique early, even preparing surprise lunch drop-offs at his office. But each effort was met with polite appreciation rather than heartfelt joy. Caroline noticed other things too. His wardrobe had changed. He now wore imported suits, cologne she didn't recognize, and his phone rarely left his side. He took calls in hushed tones, always stepping outside or lowering his voice. Still, she said nothing. She had been taught to trust her husband, to support quietly, to protect the sanctity of marriage. But deep inside, a whisper had begun, quiet but insistent, "Something is wrong." And though Caroline didn't yet have proof, her heart was already mourning a presence that had faded long before the man himself walked out the door. Vincent James never set out to be unfaithful, not at first. It began with extended meetings, then drinks after work, then late-night conversations that felt too personal to be professional. Juliet Charles made it easy. She never demanded or pushed, she simply allowed space that Caroline no longer filled because Vincent had quietly shut her out. The night it happened, there was no lightning bolt or dramatic music. Just a soft touch on his shoulder during a strategy review at Juliet's penthouse and an unspoken moment that neither of them stopped. One kiss became many. One night became several. And before long, Vincent was living a dual life, husband by title, but emotionally and physically committed elsewhere. With each passing week, Vincent grew bolder. He began spending entire weekends with Juliet under the guise of firm retreats. He justified the betrayal in his mind by vilifying the woman who had once built him from brokenness. Caroline's changed, he told Juliet one night as they shared a bottle of aged red wine on her balcony. She doesn't understand this version of me. She's content with smallness. Juliet didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stroked his hand softly and whispered, "That's because she never saw the man you're becoming." "But I do." That was all Vincent needed. He told more lies. He painted Caroline as conservative, unsupportive, emotionally distant, fabricated stories designed to absolve his guilt. "She's always working," he'd say. "She doesn't even notice when I'm gone." Juliet believed him, or at least pretended to. She used those stories to justify her presence in his life. "You deserve a woman who grows with you, not one who holds you back," she often said, planting seeds that took root in his fragile ego. Meanwhile, Caroline remained completely unaware. She still cooked his meals, prayed for him before trips, and folded his clothes with care. Vincent lived between two worlds, one built on truth, the other on illusion. And though he convinced himself he was still in control, each lie drew him deeper into a reality that no longer had room for the woman who once sacrificed everything to build his name. Caroline noticed the faint lipstick smear on Vincent's shirt collar one Tuesday evening while doing laundry. It wasn't the shade she used, hers were nude tones, this one was crimson. She held the fabric between her fingers a moment longer, heart still, breath quiet, before folding it neatly and placing it back in his wardrobe. She told herself it was probably nothing. But the signs began to accumulate. Vincent's cologne had changed to a musky foreign brand he'd never worn before. His phone, once left casually on the dining table, now followed him into every room, even the bathroom. He laughed more at late-night texts and seemed more irritated when she asked simple questions like, "Will you be home for dinner?" The shift in tone, the distant glances, the absence that didn't match the excuses, all were subtle clues in a puzzle she hadn't asked to solve. Still, Caroline chose silence. Not because she was naive, but because confrontation, in that moment, would break something she wasn't yet ready to grieve. Her boutique was growing at a remarkable pace. Her Abuja showroom had just signed a collaborative deal with a corporate bank, and orders were pouring in from across Nigeria. Clients admired her resilience and her brand's authenticity. She buried herself in work, not to escape, but to focus. If her husband was slipping away, she told herself, at least her dreams wouldn't. She expanded her operations to include custom bridal wear, hired 2 new interns, and launched a weekend workshop for young women interested in fashion design. The applause and recognition were soothing, but not loud enough to drown out the quiet ache that came with every empty chair at dinner. One afternoon, as she stepped into the bedroom to retrieve a document from Vincent's drawer, Caroline found a receipt tucked beneath a cufflink box, an invoice from a luxury hotel in Victoria Island, dated on a day Vincent had claimed to be in Port Harcourt. She stared at it for a long moment, her fingers trembling slightly, before folding it and placing it back exactly as she found it. Her heart didn't race. Instead, it settled into a deeper silence. She could confront him now. She had enough to question him. But she didn't. She closed the drawer, adjusted her blouse, and walked back into the hallway with grace. Caroline had made a choice, not of denial, but of timing. Whatever truth awaited her, she would meet it on her terms. For now, there was work to be done, clients to satisfy, and a legacy to build. Vincent may have been drifting away, but she had no intention of collapsing with him. The walls of Juliet Charles's penthouse shimmered with gold-tinted elegance, but the conversation she hosted that evening was anything but casual. Vincent sat across from her, nursing a glass of whiskey, his tie loosened and his mind clouded. Juliet had chosen the perfect moment to strike. He was tired, restless, and increasingly dissatisfied with the dual life he led. For weeks, she had watched him swing like a pendulum between obligation and ambition. She had studied his vulnerabilities, the subtle way his eyes shifted when he mentioned Caroline, the buried frustration in his tone when he spoke of home. She knew he was ready. All that was left was to hand him the pen and whisper where to sign. That night, she didn't seduce him. Instead, she positioned herself as the catalyst for his next evolution. "Vincent," she began, her voice calm, steady, persuasive, "have you ever wondered why you feel stuck? You're brilliant, charismatic, and connected, but you're still playing in circles beneath your level." He frowned. "What do you mean beneath?" She walked slowly toward the window, pulling aside the silk curtain to reveal the Lagos skyline glittering below. "You're still tied to a woman who doesn't understand the magnitude of your future. Caroline is sweet, but let's be honest, her world is too small for what you're becoming." He didn't respond. She continued, "Do you know why certain doors haven't opened for you yet? Because you haven't fully stepped into your potential. And part of that is cutting ties with what's weighing you down." Vincent tried to protest, mentioning Caroline's loyalty, her sacrifices, but Juliet was relentless. "Loyalty isn't enough," she said. "Power respects progress, not sentiment." She laid out the future like a vision board, introductions to foreign investors, joint ventures in real estate, political connections only few could access. But it all came with a condition. "I can't keep vouching for a man who's still attached to a past that doesn't serve him," Juliet said, now seated close, her eyes locked on his. "I need a partner who matches me, publicly, legally, completely." The words hung heavy in the air. Vincent swallowed hard, staring at the ring on his finger that once symbolized hope and sacrifice. In that moment, the idea of divorce, once unthinkable, began to feel strategic. Juliet didn't need to push again. She had already won. As Vincent left that night, the cool air hid his face, but the warmth of loyalty he once felt for Caroline had already begun to fade under the weight of promises too glittering to ignore. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a discreet courier in a manila envelope marked private. Caroline had just returned from a fitting session with a high-profile client when she found them lying on the entry table, Vincent's signature already scrawled in blue ink at the bottom of the last page. No note. No explanation. Just paperwork. She stood frozen, her eyes scanning the impersonal language, irreconcilable differences, amicable separation, division of assets. Her chest tightened, but she didn't cry. There were no confrontations, no dramatic shouting matches. Caroline had always known that the Vincent she married was slipping away, and now the ink confirmed what silence had long suggested. She placed the envelope down carefully, walked into the kitchen, and poured herself a glass of water. Her world wasn't ending, it was simply shifting. For Vincent, the process had been easier than expected. With Juliet's influence and access to elite attorneys, the paperwork moved swiftly. He didn't offer an apology or explanation, not because he didn't feel guilt, but because he had convinced himself this was a step forward. He believed Juliet when she said marriage to Caroline was a shackle. He believed the whispers that told him success required reinvention, even if that meant erasing the very woman who once sewed his dreams together with thread and faith. Within days of the final court hearing, Vincent had moved into Juliet's Banana Island mansion. She welcomed him with open arms, presenting him to her network as the visionary partner and praising his brilliance at exclusive dinner parties where laughter echoed over champagne glasses and forged alliances. To him, it felt like a rival. Juliet lavished him with a lifestyle he had only dreamed of, private jets to Ghana for meetings, invites to elite policy roundtables, tailored suits flown in from Milan. Her world was polished, seamless, and filled with people who dropped names like currency. Vincent began to relish the attention, no longer a boy from Ajij, but a man of influence. He changed his routines, his contacts, even his vocabulary. When friends from his past called, he ignored them. When Caroline's name came up, he offered vague replies and quick segues. To him, this was elevation. This was what he deserved. What he didn't realize was that while Caroline had been the seed that nurtured his roots, Juliet was a mirror, reflecting not who he was, but who he wanted the world to think he had become. And sometimes, the most expensive mirrors distort the truth the most. Caroline stood before the large bay window of her new apartment in Victoria Island, watching the early morning sun spill across the ocean like liquid gold. The decision to leave Lekki had not been impulsive, it was intentional. After signing the divorce papers, she had given herself 1 week to mourn, 1 week to cleanse her heart of betrayal, and then she got to work. She sold their marital house, closed her Yaba outlet temporarily, and began putting all her energy into expansion. She had always dreamed of building a fashion empire that would be more than just a brand, it would be a voice, a revolution. And now, without distractions, she finally had the fire and focus to make it happen. Her move to Victoria Island was both symbolic and strategic. It placed her in the center of Nigeria's fashion, business, and diplomatic elite. She wasn't starting over, she was stepping up. With precision and grace, Caroline rebranded Caroline Stitches into Caroline Atelier, opening a flagship store in a chic, glass-front space on Akinadesala Street. Her new collections combined heritage fabrics with modern silhouettes, each piece telling a story of African strength and elegance. Influencers, stylists, and celebrities began flocking to her studio for fittings. Within months, her designs were featured on major runways in Lagos, Johannesburg, and Accra. She launched a limited luxury line called Resilience, inspired by her personal journey. The line sold out in 48 hours. From her new office, Caroline oversaw production teams in Lagos, customer relations in Abuja, and an online global store that shipped pieces to the UK, Canada, and the US. She no longer chased opportunities, they now waited in her inbox. People didn't just want her clothes, they wanted to hear her speak at conferences and mentor programs. But Caroline remained grounded. She employed young women from underserved communities, offering them not just jobs, but full design scholarships and life coaching. She hosted Sip and Stitch weekend events where women could connect, share, and heal. And through it all, she carried herself with dignity, not once mentioning Vincent or his betrayal. She didn't need to. Her success was its own quiet revenge. Her pain had been transformed into power, her sorrow into structure. At every corner, people marveled at her glow-up. But what they didn't realize was that her radiance wasn't new, it had always been there. It just took the breaking of her old world to finally shine through. Caroline was no longer the girl who once believed love alone could fix everything. She was now a brand, a movement, a mogul, and her story was only just beginning. Vincent was riding through Victoria Island in the back seat of Juliet's bulletproof SUV when traffic slowed near a popular intersection. As his driver idled, his eyes wandered, half bored, half scrolling through his phone, until something massive caught his attention. Towering above the bustle of a Canadesala street was a sleek, 10-foot billboard glowing in afternoon light. The ad was elegant in its simplicity, a dark-skinned woman dressed in a regal green and gold iro and buba, head high, eyes bold. The words beneath it read, "Designed by Caroline Atelier, Elegance Reborn." Vincent's breath hitched in his throat. It was Caroline. Not just featured, but branded. Showcased like royalty, with the presence and poise of a woman who no longer answered to anyone's shadow. He sat forward, staring up at the image as if it might speak back. The phone slipped from his hand. Just then, a smaller line of text at the bottom of the billboard turned his confusion into disbelief. "Official designer to Her Excellency, the First Lady of Nigeria." The words felt like an uppercut. Vincent blinked several times, rereading, doubting what he saw. The First Lady? Caroline was now designing for the president's wife? The reality sank like a stone. He had spent the last year mingling with socialites, clinking glasses with investors, and pretending he had arrived. Yet here she was, no longer the grounded boutique wife Juliet mocked, but a national symbol of elegance. Dressed in poise, crowned in relevance, commanding respect without ever needing to prove herself. A sudden silence filled the car. He could hear his own heartbeat, loud and erratic, as he leaned back slowly. "Sir, everything all right?" his driver asked, glancing through the rearview mirror. Vincent didn't respond. His thoughts were a whirlwind. He hadn't heard Caroline's name in months, hadn't asked, hadn't cared. He thought she'd disappear, shrink back into the smallness he once believed she was made for. But now, every falsehood he had told Juliet about her, the simplicity, the lack of ambition, the claim that she didn't understand his world, was unraveling like thread. Caroline hadn't just moved on, she had elevated. And worse, she had done it without fanfare or revenge. No public statements. No interviews throwing shade. Just success. Visible, undeniable, unshakable success. And as Vincent sat there in that tinted car, suited in luxury but hollow at the core, he realized the woman he left behind had quietly become everything he pretended Juliet could offer. And it was too late to go back. The grand ballroom of the Eco Monarch Hotel gleamed with luxury, marble floors, golden chandeliers, and orchestras filling the air with soft classical music. The occasion was the Lagos Women in Power Gala, an annual gathering where politicians' wives, CEOs, designers, and influencers mingled under one roof to celebrate influence and style. Juliet Charles, dressed in a shimmering silver gown imported from Paris, walked into the event with Vincent by her side, exuding her usual air of superiority. Cameras flashed. Guests whispered. She loved the attention and owned every moment of it. She was there as both a guest and a sponsor, having recently invested in a media startup covering elite Nigerian social events. Vincent stayed close, quiet, scanning the room as if still unsettled by the billboard he had seen days ago, but Juliet didn't notice. Midway through the evening, as champagne glasses clinked and speeches echoed across the hall, a soft buzz rippled through the crowd. A woman had just entered. She wasn't loud or ostentatious. She wore a flowing coral-colored iro and bubo with a modern twist, tailored, structured, and commanding. Her gilly was tied with precision, and her jewelry, handcrafted gold, spoke of tradition with opulence. Unlike the other guests, she didn't wear imported fabric or designer labels. Yet somehow, all eyes were drawn to her. Even the host paused mid-sentence to acknowledge her entrance. Juliet, watching from across the room, scoffed. "Who still wears iro and buba to events like this?" she whispered to a friend, loud enough to be heard by nearby guests. "Honestly, this is a luxury gala, not a village naming ceremony." Her words earned a few shallow chuckles. But the laughter quickly faded as the woman in question turned slightly, and the room recognized her. Caroline. Confident, radiant, composed. She wasn't just attending, she was being ushered to the VIP table reserved for the First Lady's entourage. Juliet's smirk froze. Vincent stood paralyzed. He hadn't seen her in person since the divorce, and now, here she was, walking past him like a queen. The very woman Juliet had dismissed seconds ago was not just relevant, she was revered. A hush fell over Juliet's table. Someone leaned in and whispered, "That's the designer behind the First Lady's entire wardrobe. Caroline Atelier. She's the reason this gala even has a fashion segment tonight." Juliet turned pale, suddenly aware that her mockery had just turned into humiliation. Vincent could barely breathe. In that moment, dressed in silk and diamonds, surrounded by wealth and status, they both realized something chilling. They hadn't upgraded. They had underestimated. The ballroom fell into an anticipatory hush as the evening's host tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice echoing over the soft piano tune playing in the background, "our next speaker needs no introduction. She is the creative mind behind the modern revival of African elegance, the woman responsible for elevating local fashion to international status, and the designer entrusted with Her Excellency's public image. Please welcome Caroline Hendricks James of Caroline Atelier." The hall erupted into applause. Vincent clapped slowly, his hands trembling as Caroline walked confidently to the stage in her coral iro and buba, unbothered, unshaken, untouchable. Juliet sat frozen, her wine glass untouched. Caroline stood behind the podium, composed. She didn't read from notes. She didn't glance at a teleprompter. She simply spoke, each word deliberate, her voice calm but heavy with meaning. "There's something sacred about loyalty," she began. "It isn't glamorous. It doesn't trend. It doesn't throw champagne parties. But it holds you when the world forgets your name." The audience leaned in. "I was once married to a man I believed would grow with me," she continued, her eyes scanning the crowd, not with bitterness, but clarity. "We started with nothing. We built dreams on concrete floors and faith. But somewhere along the journey, success became a reason to forget." A few guests exchanged glances. Vincent bowed his head slightly, his jaw clenched. "I'm not here tonight because of fame," Caroline said. "I'm here because betrayal didn't break me, it built me. And I want every woman listening to know, you can be forgotten, mocked, replaced. And still rise." Applause began to build. She raised a hand gently, calming the room. "This outfit I'm wearing tonight? It's not just fabric. It's a reminder that your roots are not your weakness, they are your strength. And no matter who leaves, who laughs, or who lies, your worth does not diminish." When she finished, the room erupted. Guests stood to their feet. The applause thundered through the hall, rolling like a wave of vindication. Caroline smiled, not out of pride, but peace. Juliet remained seated, her eyes locked on the woman she once dismissed. Vincent stared in silence, surrounded by applause that wasn't for him, in a room that no longer saw him. In that moment, he understood, the very woman he thought he had outgrown had grown beyond every measure he once used to define success. And her voice, clear, strong, and unapologetic, had just become the most unforgettable sound in the room. Barely 2 weeks after the gala, the headlines exploded like wildfire across national dailies and social media feeds. Juliet Charles under EFCC investigation for corporate fraud. Screenshots of frozen bank accounts, leaked emails, and questionable offshore transactions flooded the internet. News anchors dissected every financial move she had made over the last year. Juliet, the once untouchable queen of high society, was now the face of scandal. Vincent stared in disbelief at the television in their Banana Island living room as breaking news segments looped the same footage, Juliet being escorted out of her office by financial crimes agents, her designer glasses failing to shield her from the barrage of flashing cameras. It felt like fiction. But this time, there was no script to rewrite it. The investigation was deep and damning. Juliet had misappropriated over $800 million in investor funds from a real estate project she had promoted as a revolutionary development for Lagos elites. Multiple stakeholders came forward, claiming they were sold non-existent properties while Juliet diverted the funds through shell companies. What shocked Vincent most was discovering his name listed on several of those company boards, companies Juliet had added him to without fully disclosing their purpose. At first, he thought he was merely a passive advisor. But now, those titles made him complicit. Within days, his name began trending for all the wrong reasons. Lawyer turned partner under probe in Juliet Charles fraud case. His firm issued a public statement distancing themselves from him. Clients began calling in to withdraw cases. Contracts were suspended. Just like that, the empire he thought he had built began to unravel. The calls Vincent made to Juliet went unanswered. The mansion that once hosted dignitaries and gala after-parties now sat eerily silent, guarded by police tape and uniformed men with stern expressions. Juliet had gone into hiding, leaving Vincent to face the music. Journalists camped outside the estate gates, flashing cameras in his face and shouting questions as he tried to step out. Did you know what Juliet was doing? Are you part of the laundering scheme? Is it true your firm cut ties with you? Vincent had no answers, just a tightening knot in his chest and a growing realization that the woman he'd bet everything on had dragged him into the depths of ruin. In his quest for an upgrade, he hadn't just lost his wife, he had gambled away his name. Vincent stood outside the gates of Goldbridge & Co., the same firm that once celebrated him with plaques and handshakes, holding an envelope that felt heavier than its contents. The letter inside was brief: termination of partnership, effective immediately. It cited reputational damage and conflict of interest stemming from the Juliet Charles scandal. No room for explanation. No room for redemption. He didn't argue. There was no one left to listen. His office access had already been revoked, his name removed from the partners' board by the elevator. As he walked away from the building he once considered his second home, he realized the fall hadn't been sudden. It had been steady, disguised as elevation. The luxury, the connections, the exclusivity, it was all smoke. And now that it had cleared, all that remained was a man with a name tarnished beyond repair. By the end of the month, his accounts were frozen as investigations deepened. He had no access to funds. Juliet's assets had been seized, and because several of them were joint under their business partnership, he was caught in the web. The house in Banana Island? Gone. The car? Repossessed. He moved into a small service apartment in Lekki, the rent covered by what little he had in a private savings account. Calls stopped coming. Friends disappeared. Invitations dried up. The same circles that once toasted to his rise now scrolled past his name with discomfort. Worse still, law firms wouldn't touch him. His name was now synonymous with scandal, not strategy. In whispered corners of courtrooms and conference halls, he was the one Juliet took down with her, or worse, the one who left his wife and lost everything. Meanwhile, Caroline flourished. Her face graced the covers of fashion magazines and business journals alike. Caroline Atelier had just secured an exclusive contract with a Pan-African trade alliance to design ceremonial attire for visiting dignitaries. Her team expanded to 50 employees across Lagos and Abuja. She was invited to host a TED-style talk on entrepreneurship, and her story, of rising after betrayal, of rebuilding from ashes, captivated the nation. Caroline's name had become a symbol of grace under pressure. She never publicly addressed her divorce or Vincent's downfall, yet the contrast between their lives spoke volumes. While Vincent scrambled to secure legal counsel and salvage remnants of his dignity, Caroline was dressing presidents, mentoring designers, and sitting on advisory boards. And though she never gloated, her very presence in every headline was a reminder of the lesson life had carved into Vincent's path: success rooted in loyalty always outlasts shortcuts cloaked in luxury. The Zenith Business Leadership Summit was one of the most anticipated corporate gatherings of the year, drawing CEOs, policymakers, and rising entrepreneurs from across Nigeria and beyond. Held at the Eco Convention Center, it was an event where reputations were made and celebrated. Caroline Hendricks James, now one of the most revered fashion moguls on the continent, had been invited as a keynote speaker. Her panel was titled Rebranding from Rock Bottom, Turning Pain into Power. The hall was packed, cameras flashing as she stepped up to the stage in a simple yet majestic navy blue jumpsuit, her braided crown wrapped in a gold headscarf that shimmered beneath the stage lights. The audience applauded as she took the mic, calm and poised, her reputation glowing brighter than any spotlight. Unbeknownst to Caroline, Vincent was somewhere in the audience, uninvited, unnoticed. He had snuck in with an old conference badge, dressed in a worn suit that once screamed power but now whispered survival. His shoes were dusty, his collar frayed. He hadn't come for networking or inspiration. He had come because this was the only place he might see her again. As she spoke about transformation, about building legacy from betrayal, his eyes watered. Every word she said felt directed at him, though she never once acknowledged his presence. After the session, guests gathered around her for autographs and photos. Security tried to clear the crowd, but Vincent pushed forward, clutching a folded letter in his hand. "Please. I just need a minute," he muttered, his voice cracking. She looked up, and for the first time in nearly 2 years, their eyes met. Caroline's face didn't betray emotion. Not anger. Not shock. Just stillness. Vincent dropped to his knees in front of her, oblivious to the murmurs and flashing cameras. Caroline. I was wrong. I was blind. I let go of gold thinking I was chasing glory. And now, I've lost everything. Please. Please forgive me. His voice broke, the room falling into awkward silence as a once-celebrated man begged before a woman he once discarded. Caroline looked at him quietly, her voice steady when she finally spoke. Vincent. Forgiveness isn't the problem. I forgave you long ago, for me, not for you. She paused, her gaze unflinching. But some lessons are meant to be lived, not reversed. She nodded at her security, who gently helped him to his feet. Without another word, she turned and walked away, dignified, graceful, untouchable, leaving Vincent surrounded by silence, holding an apology that had arrived too late. Weeks passed after the summit, but Vincent never recovered from the encounter. He replayed Caroline's words endlessly, not because they were cruel, they weren't, but because they were final. Forgiveness had come, but without restoration. She had closed the door with grace, not bitterness, and somehow that made the silence louder. He sat often by the lagoon near his modest one-room apartment in Anja, watching the water ripple quietly, reflecting on how far he had fallen, and how far she had risen. The world knew Caroline as a fashion mogul, but Vincent knew her as the woman who once gave up her savings so he could wear the very suit he now sat in, tattered and dated. The irony was cruel but just. He had mistaken her quiet strength for limitation. Now he understood it was the very force that had propelled her. Caroline never spoke publicly about him. She never gave interviews, never made social media posts hinting at her past, never used his name for sympathy or leverage. Instead, she expanded her empire into East Africa, launched a foundation for young girls in fashion, and was recently nominated for the West African Businesswoman of the Year award. She attended gala events with global dignitaries, collaborated with the First Lady on a national women's empowerment campaign, and launched a memoir titled Threaded Grace. Vincent saw her billboard again, this time at the Abuja airport. Same poise, same elegance, different glow. There was nothing vindictive in her journey. She wasn't trying to hurt him by moving on. She had simply discovered that survival wasn't enough. She was born to thrive. Back in his quiet apartment, Vincent kept the letter he'd written for her folded on his desk, unread, unneeded. He didn't mail it. There was no more begging. Only reflection. He took on freelance legal work for small businesses, far removed from the boardrooms he once lorded over. But with every file he reviewed, every low-paying case he accepted, he did it with a humility he never had before. He stopped blaming Juliet, the firm, or circumstance. The mirror had turned fully now, and he saw himself clearly. A man who thought he had upgraded, only to realize too late that he had walked away from a woman who had already become everything he ever claimed to want. In her success, he saw his lesson, not just of love lost, but of character revealed. And that lesson, etched in time, would follow him for the rest of his life. That's the end of the story. What did you learn about the story? Please leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more interesting stories. Thanks for watching.